A tool that Asheville has used is a tree canopy ordinance, and it has specifics that I'm less familiar with than I need to be at this point, but has specifics about how to maintain tree canopy. And so I think that there are creative ways that we can allow for both of these things. We can have infill development that, again, helps address the housing and the climate crisis, but also maintains in a better, robust, healthy way the existing urban tree canopy. So that, yeah, I would say separate sort of regulations can be helpful.
And also, when you're using the same footprint, you're actually disrupting less of the environment. So, like Hawkins Point, for example, we actually had to shorten it by a floor due to lack of support on the council. And that reduced the amount of housing for elderly, disabled folks by 20-something units, I believe. So, going up is better for the environment in general. You're disrupting less of the tree canopy in general, but still able to kind of allow us to be able to serve more folks.
Yeah, we completely agree. Up is great. And again, we want to preserve existing tree canopy in our forests and surrounding the perimeter or periphery of our existing communities and developments where infrastructure already is as well. And I think it can be hard for existing residents who are reluctant to have development in their own neighborhood see the tree that's going to come down. I can definitely relate to this in my neighborhood, and be sad for losing that shade and that. Right now especially, it's fall and the trees are stunning, right? And I don't want to lose any of them anywhere. And yet the prospect of maintaining more tree canopy, more forest further from the city centers and allowing and welcoming more neighbors into my community who need housing, to me seems like sort of the best compromise for all of us. And again, that addresses climate change in addition to addressing the housing crisis. So I totally feel people's enthusiasm for tree canopy. I share it, and yet this sort of seems like the best compromise that can be that can work.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Madam
Yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem, if I'll ask one question of Susan and Nancy. Just, you mentioned manufactured homes, which is something that we as a staff have talked about and, looked at the issues related to the older homes versus the newer. Have you come across any sample ordinances, really? Because I think as we infill or insert manufactured homes into older neighborhoods or into established neighborhoods, obviously adjoining property owners have questions and concerns and those kind of things. Have you come across or developed are there any model ordinance out there that deal with, things such as design standards, underpinning things that come along with, the manufactured housing? And it would be helpful if there's, ideal or perfect model ordinances where somebody's done it successfully to ease some of the concerns of the adjoining property owners as it relates to pitch of roof and, again, underpinning and removing all the things that make it a manufactured or movable home. And then it'll take the General Assembly or somebody else to deal with some of the issues associated with how it's taxed and how it may be treated like a motor vehicle versus treated like a traditional home. So, so any guidance that Mountain Tree may come up with that would be helpful. So.
Yeah, so I know that our Director of Healthy Communities, Chris Joyelle, has done a lot of work with the Emma community outside of Asheville that is primarily made up of mobile home residents, and they have developed a 10-point policy agenda for ways to both avoid displacement but also create policy allowances for mobile homes. And he can speak to the details of those policies more, but I know that it is a state-level issue in addition to local options. And I will ask, I don't know if you know more of those details, but I can ask Chris to send you what he has found and what he knows that we have seen so far.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in learning more about ADUs as well, and I know that was a topic of discussion for John and I this week. We were in Raleigh for the NCLF kind of follow-up on affordable housing, and that's definitely something that I'm interested in encouraging more of in the city. And also, it also makes sense for an investment purpose for folks who maybe can use that as some supplemental income as well. So I think it makes sense, and I hope that we can move towards doing more of that as well.
I think that's totally true, and I would say one of the places I have seen resistance to allowing or incentivizing more ADUs being built is the concern about short-term rentals and how that won't actually help address the housing crisis and the housing shortage. I've also seen statistics saying that the boom in Airbnbs and short-term rentals is now on the downward trend, which I find optimistic. And it seems like it's so difficult, it's gotten to be such a competitive market that it's difficult to maintain your short-term rental at a high enough standard to meet the market's expectations of what they're going to get when they reserve or rent their Airbnb. And so people are starting to realize, well, there are some benefits to hotels, and maybe I should go back to that model and, walk to the restaurant around the corner or what have you. So I am hopeful that by allowing ADUs to increase our housing stock, that trend will continue to play out, and there won't be just an explosion in short-term rentals by allowing ADUs, but that rather it will increase the availability of long-term, whether it's long-term rental or ownership, what have you, but it will make a dent in the housing shortage issue by having that stock online.
Yeah, and I think it also addresses a lot of generational issues too with aging parents, who right now cannot afford, my parents could not afford to live here, and for them to be able to live on family land or, property that is already owned by a family member and, provide them housing that's close to a family member too, I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, completely agree, yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, sure thing.
Any other questions for them? Well, thank you, Susan and Nancy. This program is refreshing, I think, for most of us to hear. And we really appreciate the relationship the city has with Mountain True, and we're glad that we're able to continue keeping this dialogue through this program. Yeah. Thank you for coming
Thanks
to talk
for
to
your
us about it. Thank you. Okay. Next up, instant runoff elections.
Hi, I'm Lynn McFarland from the League of Women Voters of Henderson County. I'm the chair of the Voter Services team. And what we're here really to talk about today is what we would prefer to call ranked choice voting. The automatic runoffs are kind of part of that. The League of Women Voters supports ranked choice voting, and Hendersonville has done it before, about 6 years ago, I think. And we hope we'll do it again. It makes more votes truly count. And one thing we often hear when we're out at voter engagements is that I'm not going to register, I'm not going to vote, I don't think my vote counts. So the League of Women Voters collaborates with other nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations, and Better Ballot North Carolina and Fair Vote have partnered with many leagues across the North Carolina and the U.S. Diane Silver is the legislative lead for Better Ballot North Carolina and full-time staff at Fair Vote, and she is going to go into more details on this.
Thanks, Lynn. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It's good to see you. I'm Diane Silver, and is this the slide? Aha, great. So, just real quick, Better Ballot North Carolina, that's the organization who I'm representing here. We are, as Lynn said, a nonpartisan advocate for ranked choice voting to give voters greater choice and greater voice and more representative democracy for everyone. So what I would like to go through real quick today, I hope to be brief, a quick overview of what ranked choice voting is and how it works, a quick history of how it was, when and how it was used in Hendersonville, how it would be relevant today for Hendersonville, and a proposed action that we're seeking. And I'll actually jump to the chase as a preview for context. At the end, what we are going to ask you is a resolution or some kind of signaling to the state legislature to seek authorization for municipalities to have the option to adopt ranked choice voting if they want to. The big crux of the matter for our organization is that right now municipalities don't even have a choice. So on the one hand, I'm here to share a little bit about ranked choice voting and why we think it's beneficial, but whether you want it or not here in Hendersonville, we think that this is an issue of local control and local autonomy. autonomy, which I think is relevant to all municipalities across the state. And so we're looking for support from city councils across the state to make that request to the state legislature. Because when we go to the legislature and we say, hey, we want to work on this in cities, but we need authorization, they say, well, we're not hearing from any cities that they even care about this. So we have to sort of step back a step and approach city councils and say, hey, how about asking for it from the state? So that's what our ask is at the end. But I'll backtrack and just do a quick review. Ranked choice voting is, as it says, a method of voting in which the voters rank order the candidates instead of just picking one. So your ballot would look something like this grid that you see with the little bubbles from back in school, where you bubble in the first column, your first choice candidate. In the second column, your second choice. Everybody knows how to rank things. We rank things all the time. Could you go get me ice cream? Sure. What flavor would you like? Chocolate. What if they don't have chocolate? Well, then get me vanilla. That's a ranked order. That's a ranked choice. So that's how it works for the voter. It's very straightforward. Then, when we tally the votes, the big idea is that you need a majority of votes to win. And so you can see on the graph, the 50% threshold is the majority threshold. So in round one, only the first choice votes are counted. This is one person, one vote, just like it always has been. And if somebody gets a majority of votes, then they win that seat. But if nobody does, then the lowest vote getter is eliminated. And then we have a runoff. And it's just like we do runoffs again. It's as if everybody goes to vote again. But the beauty is, instead of everybody having to actually go back to the polls and vote again, this time with only 3 candidates and not 4, we can run the tally for that runoff instantly. That's why it's called an instant runoff, because by rank ordering on the ballot, the election officials, the county clerk, knows who all of those voters who supported the dropped-out candidate, who they would vote for in the runoff. It's their second choice. And so those votes simply are counted as the runoff tally, and we see if somebody gets a majority. And if nobody does, then wash, rinse, repeat, right? We eliminate the lowest vote getter, and then we don't have to all go back to the polls again. The vote is already there on your ballot. We can tally them up in another runoff, and eventually somebody reaches that majority threshold. So that's how ranked choice voting works. It has a whole bunch of advantages. For voters, for Better Ballot, from our perspective, we're most interested in the benefits to voters. It gives voters more choice. It eliminates the spoiler effect, if you are familiar with that, where if there are multiple candidates who are pretty like-minded, they can split the vote of that constituency, and then the result could be that a candidate with minority support could actually win, even though they're not the preference of the majority of voters. So this better reflects the will of the majority of voters. It changes political incentives and leads to more positive campaigning because as a candidate, it is a disincentive to alienate the supporters of other candidates. It leads people to campaign in a way of saying, hey, I hope you'll vote for me for your first choice. But if I'm not your first choice, at least make me your second choice. And it turns the whole campaign more positive. And you all have run for office, so I know that you can relate to the whole campaign environment. It gives greater participation to overseas voters because of the time needed for mail-in ballots. And if there's a need for a runoff, I don't know if you've had to have a lot of runoffs here in Hendersonville, but in general, an advantage of ranked choice voting is that it ensures that overseas voters have their ballot counted even in a runoff situation. And it does produce those majority winners. For candidates, very similar advantages. It helps the campaign stay more issue focused, which means you don't have to be on the defense. And as you know, a defensive campaign is far less fun and less effective and not what you were hoping to communicate to voters when you chose to run for office. It reduces the weaponization of being primaried. That's a term in elections now these days. And it reduces that whole threat, which helps to reduce hyperpartisanship in our discourse. It allows candidates to run collaboratively with like-minded candidates. When you're very similar to another candidate, instead of being opponents, you can be collaborators, which is what we're looking for in leadership, is collaboration. And it allows for a nuanced platform where you can say, well, you know, I'm in this camp on these issues, and I'm in this camp on these issues, and I'm in this camp on these issues, and you can shape your platform for, you know, how you really feel, and like-minded voters will support you. And you might not be everybody's first choice, but maybe you'll be some people's second choice. And in the end, the people who win represent the will of the majority of the voters. So there's a lot of advantages. Ranked choice voting is used in over 50 jurisdictions across the United States today. It's in 2 states statewide for federal elections, and so in Maine, it's for federal offices statewide. In Alaska, they use it for state as well as federal offices. And then there are a whole bunch of municipalities across the country in all of these states that are listed, where some municipalities are using it at the local level. So it's a growing movement. It's the fastest growing electoral reform in the country, and every year more and more municipalities are adopting it because it really is just a very common sense reform. Internationally, it's been in use in these places: New Zealand and Australia, Ireland and Scotland, and the metropolis of Malta. But the point is, it's been in use for over 100 years in these locations. So this is a very tried and true method. It's not some fringe experimental kind of thing. Here in Hendersonville, Hendersonville participated in the pilot program in the 2000s. In 2007 through 2011, the state offered a pilot program for any municipality that wanted to participate, and Hendersonville said, we're in. And so it was used in 2 elections. I think it was in 2007 and in 2009. And here in Hendersonville, there was a multi-seat provision where it was used actually for the city council elections, which are a multi-seat race, as you know. It certainly appeared to be well accepted. The North Carolina, NC State Poli-Sci department did exit polling on those election days and asked voters, how'd you like it? And 85% said, we like it. We want to do it again, like it better than the old method, because it gives voters that opportunity to express more preference. And so everybody likes having more input. City Council at that time did vote to re-up during that pilot. I think they signed on initially to give it a try. Did it in 2007. It went well. They said, let's do it again. So that speaks to that it was well received. Regretfully, in our opinion, the whole pilot program sunsetted in 2012, and so then elections reverted back to the just pick one method and the plurality winners. The relevance today is a couple of things. There's a whole bunch of problems with our elections currently that ranked choice voting can solve. I don't know that those problems are particularly an issue here in Hendersonville. It actually looks to me like you guys have your act together pretty well. So I'm not going to try to pitch you on all these problems where I think you would say, well, that doesn't happen here in Hendersonville. But the point is that my understanding is that lately the city has been instructed to switch your elections from your odd year elections to even years, which changes your election cycle. And then my understanding is that then the county came in and said, hey, since you're going to be on even years along with everybody else, we'd love it if you would now move your primaries to the spring when everybody else does them, so that we don't have to run a separate primary just for Hendersonville. But what that means is that now your primary, I think that you all have had a nice system of having your primary pretty close to the general election, because it keeps the campaign season pretty concise. And now it's going to be a much longer campaign season for everybody, for voters and for candidates. It means that voters face what is the very real phenomenon of voter exhaustion. I got to tell you, I'm feeling exhausted about the 2024 elections already. So a longer election season is not great for everybody, and it's expensive for candidates to have to campaign for a much longer period of time. And I think that has the potential of disincentivizing good people from throwing their hat in and serving the city. Not that I'm trying to get people to run against you all, but for the future. The other thing is that it allows you to consolidate the election into a single election when the turnout is highest. So instead of having your primary now switch to the spring and having that longer election season, you could do away with the primary altogether, and you can just do this ranked ballot. You can do the whole kit and caboodle in one consolidated election, and you can have it in November when the turnout is the highest. And that makes campaign season shorter, and it also saves a bunch of money. The 2021 primary cost about $17,000 to administer, that was billed to the city. Now, $17K isn't a ton of money probably in your whole budget, but it's significant money. I can think of a lot of things to do with $17,000. So that's an incentive just right there. If for no other reason, if you said our elections are working great, we don't really have any problems that need solved, that alone I think would be a good reason to make this change. But as I said at the beginning, right now, even if you want to, you're not allowed to. And so what we're asking from City Council is to consider this switch and to consider making a request to the state legislature to ask for authority to adopt ranked choice voting if you wanted to, and opt in for municipalities. It could be done through a resolution. That would be, non-binding, that's simply signaling a desire. Or if you wanted to do something stronger, you could do a trigger ordinance, which would actually have teeth that would say when these conditions are met, namely the state gives us the authorization, then it will go into effect. And then you wouldn't have to discuss it again and go through the whole process again. It would be on the books and you could just implement it. And then you work with your state representatives to make the request. I have to admit, I'm a little bit pessimistic about how open-minded your state representatives are going to be to this, but I'm optimistic about the fact that it's a bigger picture than that. What we're trying to do as Better Ballot, because we're a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, we're making this kind of a pitch to city councils across the state. And what we're trying to do is get a handful of cities who are all on board, willing to do some kind of a resolution or a trigger ordinance, so that we can go to legislators at the state level and say, hey, here's a couple dozen municipalities that all want to do this. Let's give local control. Let's do local autonomy and let the cities decide what method is best for them. And so we're asking folks one at a time. So if for no other reason than that, local control, local autonomy, we hope that you would support that and do a request. So that's my pitch. And thank you for the time. And Lynn and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions for Diane?
Can you share the resolution so that we can share it with the city council and have them consider it at a future meeting?
I can provide some model language.
Model,
I don't have
okay.
it on me
Okay.
today.
Yeah, sure.
But,
Yeah.
but yes, we have model language that we can certainly share and
So
work
they
with you to
can
draft.
discuss it. And thank you.
All right.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you very much for coming to share that with us.
Appreciate it.
Okay, next up, system development fees. Adam, have you gotten used to the title Utilities Director yet? Well, the illustrious Utilities Director,
Yeah,
Adam
say it
Stewart.
again. So Adam Stewart, Utilities Director, City of Hendersonville. Good afternoon, Mayor and members of City Council. I think this is the third or fourth time we've presented system development fees to this council. This presentation will be very similar to the previous presentations, but we're going to be giving an overview of the final report and recommendations. David Hyder is with us. He's with the Stantec Consulting. He's performed the analysis and prepared the report, and I'll turn it over to David. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you, Adam. Again, Dave Hyder with Stantec. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Mayor, members of the council. I'm going to go over the water and sewer system development fees. I know this isn't the first time you've seen it, so I'll try to hit the highlights and make sure anything that's different, I'll call that out. In terms of the presentation, I'm going to go over a little bit of the background, just remind you what these fees are. We'll talk about the approach that we've used, the calculations, what the fees look like, and then round it out with some water and sewer rate impacts. So what would it look like if you were to adopt the system development fees? So first off, system development fees, they're fees that are charged to new connections joining your water and wastewater system, or they're also charged to connections that require additional capacity. So if you had a redevelopment or a tear down or something like that and they needed a bigger meter size, they would also be subject to system development fees. Excuse me. They are intended to recover the cost of constructing water and sewer system capacity. So you have to build this system in advance of people joining the system. And so the concept is that it's a growth pays for growth philosophy. The fees do need to be applied based on units of service, which just means that you need to recognize that when a customer joins, it's a larger customer than a smaller customer. The larger customer is going to pay more in system development fees. And it's also important to note that Hendersonville did charge system development fees until 2016, at which time they were removed. So the SDFs do allow a community to recover at least a portion of the cost of constructing system infrastructure. If you think about the current approach that you have right now, your sole source of revenues is really water and sewer rates. So they're paying for the operations of the system, the capital, both rehabilitation as well as the expansion of the system. So that is your sole source of revenues currently. There are oftentimes when a community doesn't have system development fees, there's concerns that it might impact development, but they are extremely common in North Carolina. As of a 2019 survey, there's about 81 North Carolina utilities that charge system development fees. And I know that there's been at least a dozen since that study that have now adopted them as well. Most large cities, similar sized of Hendersonville, do have system development fees, so very common. These fees are legislated in the state of North Carolina, so there's an analysis that has to be prepared by a financial professional. That analysis has to be posted on your website for 45 days for a comment period, and then you'd actually have to have a public hearing if you were going to adopt system development fees. You got to track the revenues that you collect from them separately, and there are limitations in terms of what you can use the system development fees for, which I'll cover in a little bit here. Now this figure probably looks familiar. This is your capital improvement plan for the next 10 years from fiscal year 2023. Got about $300 million worth of capital investments. You can see that some of that, the black, is repair and replacement of what you already have constructed. The blue is what I want to highlight here, which is the expansion of the system. So you do have over half of that $300 million, $182 million is planned to expand the water and sewer system going forward. So you are facing a significant amount of expansion within your system. So within the legislation, there's 3 different methodologies or ways that you can calculate system development fees that are listed here. The methodology that we've used and we're recommending for the city is called the combined method. And essentially what that does is that calculates the fees based on the historical investments you've made in the system, plus those CIP projects that are going to expand the system. So it looks backwards as well as forwards and brings those costs together. And typically that's used for a system where you do have capacity to sell, so you're not out of capacity in your water and sewer systems today, but you're also, as we just looked at on the prior slide, planning to add a significant amount of expansion to the system. So again, we use the combined method. And what that looks like in terms of the actual calculations, I won't go through the gory details here, but essentially what you're doing with the system development fee is you're attempting to price capacity. So what does it cost us to provide capacity in the system? And so what you're doing there is you're taking the value of the system, which I talked about as the historical investment, plus the future that's going to add capacity to the system. We have to take out some credits within the legislation. It requires you to take out outstanding principal on debt, any assets that you didn't purchase. So if it was a donated or contributed asset, you can't include vehicles and non-core assets and things like that. So that's our numerator, and then the denominator is essentially the capacity in the system. So how much capacity do you have both in your current system plus what you're planning to build within that capital improvement plan? So an important nuance here is in order to look at that the capacity in the system, we also have to look at what's a unit of service. So how would we price this if we're going to scale it based on the larger customer paying more and smaller customer paying less? And the way you typically do that for the water system is to look at the average actual use. So a single-family home on average uses about 136 gallons per day in Hendersonville. That would be equivalent to what's often termed an equivalent residential unit, or ERU. Your multifamily customers, per unit, they use about 85 gallons per day, and then mobile homes, manufactured homes use 133 gallons per day, so very similar to a single-family home. And then when you're looking at the water system, you have to size the system for maximum day, so what's the maximum day that you see during a year, and you have to be prepared to be able to provide that. So we take that 136 gallons per day per ERU, we apply a max day factor, saying that on your system you typically see a 1.5 peak. So I would say our peak day usage per ERU would be 204 gallons per day. So that's our defined unit of service. Multifamily units are at about 63% of that. And then on the sewer side, it's a little bit different. The sewer side, we're using the North Carolina planning requirements. And before 2 weeks ago, the planning requirement was 120 gallons per day per bedroom was what you had to require to be planning for. And we've been assuming 2 bedrooms per home. So we're using a sewer use per ERU of 240 gallons per day. And multifamily units are 63% of that. As of 2 weeks ago, the legislature passed a new requirement, which says that now you don't have to plan for 120 gallons per day. You can plan for 75 gallons per day, which is quite a reduction. If we were to apply that under this scenario where we're assuming 2 bedrooms, that would mean we'd be at 150 gallons per day as our planning. And so at this point, given the fact that it's just changed, the analysis has been complete, we're going to work with staff to look at what the impacts that would potentially be. We're not necessarily comfortable recommending using 150 gallons per day. We don't think that's enough from a planning standpoint. So we're going to be tweaking that. But in all likelihood, if we do come down from 240, that would have an impact on the fee, and it would actually lower the system development fees. That'll be showing in the coming up slides. So in terms of the actual calculations, this is for the water system. The total value of the system, about $205 million. That's the historical investments plus the future. We take out the outstanding debt and those credits. It reduces our net system value to $126 million. Then with your current capacity plus what you're adding with the CIP, you're at 18 million gallons per day. So we divide that by the 204, which says that we can essentially serve 88,000 equivalent residential units in the system. We do the math, and that calculates to a water system development fee of about $1,400 per ERU, or about $7 per gallon per day. Similar analysis on the sewer side. You can see smaller system, so the value's less, about 138 million. We take out those credits, get us down to 86 million. Again, smaller system with the expansion in the future, you're going to be at 7.8 MGD. Using that 240 gallons per day, would say you could serve 32,000 ERUs in the system. So it calculates out to 2,600. So just for example here, if the 240 does come down, that would mean essentially that you'd have more units in the system, and therefore that would change that bottom line number. That's an important consideration, and that's what we'll be looking at going forward. But the $11 per gallon per day wouldn't change. It's just essentially what you look at on a per unit basis. Okay, so then shifting gears a little bit, how would we actually assess the system development fees? As I mentioned earlier, you do need to scale them based upon the demands that are going to be placed on the system. Lots of different ways to do it. You can scale them based on meter size. So the American Water Works Association provides meter equivalents, and that's in the table shown here. Essentially just means the larger your meter is, the more water you can demand on the system. So your typical single-family home is a 3/4 inch meter. If you're a 4-inch meter, you can basically use 21 times what a 3/4 inch could. You could also use heated square footage. You could use customer type and combinations and things of that sort. Looking at a survey that was completed by the UNC School of Government back in 2019, this is just an example of the various assessment methods that are used throughout the state. So you can see the vast majority do use meter size. Some use customer type or some combination. So working with staff, we did some analysis to see if there is real variation in terms of how customers use water within your system, and particularly on a single-family home basis. And so what this chart shows is the top is a single-family home, and then it's the heated square footage of each of those homes, so going from less than 1,000 up to over 4,000. And what we found in the analysis was that we did see a trend where the bigger your home is, the more water you use on average. And so this would argue that an approach like this would be appropriate to actually assess the system development fees based upon the heated square footage for single family. And then we look at multifamily per unit. They use about 85 gallons per day, as I mentioned. Mobile homes use 133. But when we look at non-residential at a 3/4 inch meter, they actually use quite a bit more than a typical single family home, which again uses 136. And so that one we would recommend using the 237. We then do have to apply that 1.5 peaking factor, and so these are ultimately our units of service that we would use to set the system development fee. So if you remember back, we were talking $7 per 1,000 gallons per day. It would basically be $7 times these would give us our system development fees for water. And then on the sewer side, similar analysis where we're looking at, again, the planning standards. We use those flow ratios that you see on the water side. And so with the 240 that we talked about earlier, this would be what would be multiplied by the $11 per 1,000 gallons per day to come up with the system development fee for sewer. And so what this looks like when you bring it all together, and this is single family residential, again, proposing charging based upon the size of the household. You can see the water charge starting at $1,200, going up to about $2,000 for homes over 4,000 square feet of heated square footage. On the sewer side, $2,300 up to $3,600, and then in total you can see the $3,500 up to $5,600, and then the multifamily would be per unit. On the non-residential side, again, we're recommending scaling that based on meter size, so we're using that base unit that I talked about earlier, what we see for a non-residential at the 3/4 inch meter, and then scaling that up. Because of the amount of water that you can use when you're a larger meter, they do scale pretty significantly. But it's important to note that you only have a handful of customers at those larger meter sizes, and you don't have any at the 8 or 10 inch. So to provide a little bit of context in terms of what other communities charge and where you would be, for a typical single-family home, 2,100 square feet, you'd be at the lower end of the range here at about 1,400 in comparison to surrounding jurisdictions. And then using that 240 gallons per day that I talked about earlier, you would be more in the middle of the range on the sewer side at 2,600. And again, if we determine that we should come down off that 240, likely you would drop down on the list in terms of the sewer system development fee. So bringing it all together, what you actually charge for full cost of a system development fee when you're joining the system and you have a new connection, a new tap, and this is just showing again for that single family home. If the city installs for a typical single family home, you have your water system development fee, your sewer system development fee, and then you currently charge a tap fee, which is making the connection to the water line. You also have the meter charge, and then you have the sewer tap. So in total, we're looking at $7,300 if the city installs the connection. If a developer installs it, you'd still have the system development fees, but there would only be the meter fee because they essentially fund the installation. So then it would be about $4,500. So now switching gears, I know there's a lot on this table, but just wanted to talk about how does this system development fee impact your current ratepayers? Because just as a reminder, this is just impacting those that are joining the system. So your existing ratepayers aren't impacted by this, other than the fact that if you do put these in place, you'd get an additional revenue stream, which would allow you to help fund your system going forward. And so what this table shows is up at the top. These are the rate increases that we talked about last April. In terms of ongoing rate increases on the water side of 11%, 12% on the sewer side. Again, these aren't set in stone. You look at these every single year. But this is the forecast as it stands right now. And then we basically ran 3 scenarios and said, well, if you put in system development fees at the calculated amounts that I've shown today, and if you have the known development that's out there right now, if that completes at 80%, you would be able to basically step off of your rate increases by about 2%. 2% for water, 2% for sewer. So coming down from 11 to 9 and 12 to 10. If development happens at a completion rate of 60%, that's the mid case, you could come down a little bit less. And then if there's only a 20% execution of that development, you'd be able to come down even less. But again, this is a new revenue source. It would allow you to reduce the rate increases going forward to some level. So what does this look like? Up at the top is the monthly bill, what we're forecasting with 11 and 12% increase for a typical single-family home. It's about $62 in 2025. Again, if you do 11% and 12% increase, this is somebody using 5,000 gallons per month, and that would go up to $115 by the end of the period, assuming no system development fees. If you put in the high case, the mid case, or the low case, you can see the difference in terms of the monthly bill. And then that annual difference is, since these are monthly bills, the annual amount reduction in a customer's bill they would see as a result of not having to increase rates as much. Cumulatively, under the high case, we're looking at about an $800 savings. The mid case, it's about $600, and then the low case, about $300. So it certainly would save your customers going forward. Looking at a non-residential example, so this is somebody that uses 80,000 gallons per month. So a bigger customer, their current bill, assuming you do those rate increases, would be about $1,100 per month. It would go up to about $2,000 per month. And because they're using so much more water, essentially they would see pretty significant savings in terms of their bills cumulatively over the period. We're looking at about over $14,000, the high case, $10,000 on the mid case, and about $5,500 on the low case. But again, this would benefit all your existing customers in that you would have that additional revenue stream to help fund your system going forward. So keep a couple more items just to wrap up. So again, system development fees can only be used for capital-related expenditures. So you can't use them for operating costs, things of that sort. You can use them to cash fund capital projects. So you could build up some system development fees and then basically fund a capital project or the beginning of a capital project. It can be growth-related or rehab. Given that we're using the combined approach, you can also use system development fees to pay debt service. The system development fee revenues can be pledged towards your debt service coverage requirements. So you need to have a certain amount of revenue in comparison to your debt. And so this can help you meet those coverage requirements, which is beneficial when you're issuing new debt. You do need to track them in a separate fund. The legislation talks about calling it a capital reserve fund, and you need to track how you're spending it. One of the common practices that we see communities use when they have system development fees is that they'll actually use them to cash fund capital projects, which not only takes the burden off of your existing customers, but it also reduces the interest in terms of not having to make those borrowing amounts, or those borrowing requirements. So wrapping it up, again, these are fees that are assessed just on new connections or somebody that wanted upsize. Follows the mantra of growth paying for growth. Right now, the full burden of these, of your cost of operating and maintaining the system is on your existing customers. I do firmly believe that if you put these in place, it would allow you to reduce those rate increases we've talked about, also reduces your borrowing requirements. And it's also an equitable way to assess the fees. So those that are larger are going to pay more. All your existing customers have invested in the system as it stands today, and they would benefit from that investment, and the people are buying into the system. So finally, this has been a pretty extensive process. I was presenting last October, gave you a System Development Fee 101 presentation. We provided some initial results last April. Adam was briefing you over the summer in terms of the additional analysis that was completed. That report that was required to be posted was posted on September 4th. It was open for that 45-day comment period. You didn't receive any comments. We're doing the final presentations here in October, and then there will be a presentation to the City Council on January 4th for consideration for adoption. I did want to mention that given the change in the state legislature on that flow requirement, we are going to be coming back with potentially some modifications. If anything, the fee would not go any higher. It's just going to come down a little bit on the sewer side. But I know that staff will work with how to brief council before that next meeting. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Got a question?
I was just going to make a comment comment.
Okay.
So, members of council, as you saw with David's schedule there, you're scheduled this to be on your January agenda to vote on. Ultimately, if we stay on the current schedule, we're going to, our legal team's going to evaluate what the change at the legislature means. But anyway, if we stay on this schedule, you are scheduled to vote on it at your January meeting. And really, the policy decisions for the council will be, do we reinstate system development fees, and at what level? David has shared in the report and is required by the legislation to show the max amount. City council does have, I believe, some discretion to, you can't go higher than what is in the report, but you can go lower. So things to consider as you hear from other citizens and other folks, other customers in the community. We've made just about all of our presentations. We were supposed to make a presentation to the chamber tomorrow, but I don't know that Brent's told David yet, but that meeting's been canceled. So we're going to have to reschedule that meeting. And then ultimately, but it's, we've made all our public presentations, so you'll start hearing more in the community as we head toward that final presentation, which will include a public hearing as part of that process. So, just want to kind of give you those facts as you think about this.
Okay.
To that point, this is one of the more extensive periods and outreaches that I've seen in terms of system development fees. So you're certainly not springing it on the community, based on my experience. It's been very thorough.
Surprised that we got no comments. I think we'll get plenty of comments very soon.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions, Debbie? Okay. Thank you, David.
All right, appreciate it.
We appreciate your work on this.
Thank you.
Okay. Last but certainly not least, City Council Member Replacement Process Update.
Can't make it any taller. Thank you. I'm going to be very quick. So, as you know, there is now a vacant seat on City Council, and so I have prepared for you the excerpt from your charter and from the general statutes that governs how you fill the vacancy. Your charter says that you all will fill the vacancy by majority vote, and the person will, until the next election. The North Carolina General Statutes provide the same thing, that because if the timing were a little bit different, the rule might be different under the General Statutes, but as it stands, it's the same provision, that you all will appoint the candidate to fill the vacancy until the election, and then the successor would be elected for the remainder of the unexpired term. So what does this mean? First of all, both the charter and the statutes use the word shall, which means you must fill the vacancy. The method to use to fill the vacancy is up to you all. Totally at your discretion. As we talked about, the person appointed would serve until the next election, which would be through November of next year. At the November 2024 election, somebody would be elected to serve the remainder of the term, which would be 2 years, through November of 2026. The seat would be elected separately from the other 2 seats. All seats would be elected using the same method, likely the plurality method. I checked before coming over, and there's only one more vote in the House that's necessary to make that pass, and it probably happened during the time that we've been sitting here, so I believe it probably has passed. The filing period for both the newly vacant 2-year seat and for the upcoming vacancies would be December 4th through 15th of this year. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that the 3 of you may have. Otherwise, we'll be putting it on your agenda for the November meeting to have a discussion about how you would like to go about filling that vacancy.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you.
Did you have a question? Thank you.
And I would just add, I do think we'll discuss it on the 2nd, but also expect there may likely be some nominations by the city council at that point. Just want to clarify that with the public and with the council as we head into that November 2nd meeting, and just reiterate to the folks who are considering to run for our city council elections that the filing period is December, as our city attorney said, so don't want that to catch anybody by surprise. It has been moved from July to the December filing period. So those of you interested in running, that's the filing period, the 4th through the 15th. So
What a lovely holiday gift.
yes, it is.
Okay, if there is nothing else, then I believe we are adjourned. Thank you very much.